Hello, everybody, and good. And thank you for joining this United Europe event with Shireen Wheeler and Anu Bradford, the author of this book here, Brussels Effect. We're going to talk through some of the themes on that. A little bit of housekeeping. We're going to stick to a tight agenda. We want to finish punctually 60 minutes from now. So please try and keep your questions to the point. If you wish to ask a question, post in the chat function, and Shireen will choose who and when to, and then you can turn your camera and your microphone on and ask the question directly. Please do stay on mute and do keep your camera off. There will be a separate session for YPAs directly with Anu at some time in the future. So if your question doesn't get answered, or if you don't get a chance to ask your question, you will have another opportunity. Those are YPAs. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, James, very much. Hi, everybody, all of you joining. I can't see you there, but I assume you are. Hello to those of you that I already know, and welcome to those I don't. We're really happy to be joined today by Anu, as James mentioned. Anu Bradford is Professor of Law at Columbia Law School and the author of this book, which was published at the beginning of the year. It's a very timely, rich book on the Brussels effect, which I think is a phrase that Anu coined herself some years ago in response to some articles and views around what was seen and perceived of as the waning power of Europe, of the European Union, to be precise. And this is a riposte to that, how the European Union rules the world. So we're going to talk about what that actually means in practice. Hi, Anu, are you there? And are you ready for our conversation?
Absolutely. Hi, Shireen. Hi, everybody. I'm glad that you're all joining us for this conversation.
Great. So what we're going to do is chat a little bit, just not for too long, and then invite all of you who've joined to pose your questions, your views perhaps as well. As James said, there is a little chat box, I think, on the right-hand corner at the top, which I will be monitoring. Do feel free in the course of our chat to just say who you are and roughly the topic of your conversation, but your question, but don't worry about typing the whole thing out. And then I'll invite you to put the question yourself to Anu. But anyway, let's kick off. And let me just ask you a pretty easy one, I think, Anu, first of all, which is, what do you actually mean by the Brussels effect, for those of you who haven't read the book yet?
Great. So, Shireen, the Brussels effect refers to the European Union's unilateral ability to regulate the global marketplace. So the EU is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world. And there are very few global companies that can afford not to trade in the EU. So in order to trade in the EU, these companies follow the European regulations. But often they decide that it is in their interest to extend these same regulations across their global production and global conduct, because they want to avoid the cost of complying with multiple regulatory regimes. So all the EU needs to do is to regulate the single market. And it is then the market forces and the self-interest of global corporations that transpose those rules across the world.
So, I mean, let's get straight to the chase in a way, Anu. I mean, you say in the book that the book is largely descriptive, and indeed you do talk about the various regulations, the various areas where you believe this Brussels effect is actually happening. What kind of areas are we talking about? I mean, what particular sectors do you think are we seeing this effect manifesting itself most obviously?
Right. So what to me is so interesting is that you can see the same phenomena across so many different policy domains and different industries. So I think this week is a very good time to talk about digital economy. If you think about the Commission just unveiling on Tuesday its new DMA and DSA, the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act. But if we think about the general data protection regulation and the extent to which that has become the global standard for data privacy, that is one example where we see the Brussels exert this influence globally. The regulation of hate speech online, the way we are governing what kind of speech stays up and is removed from the platforms, another example from the domain of digital economy. But we also see this in environmental domain. So if we think about climate change, or we think about regulation of hazardous substances in electronics or animal welfare, those are some examples as well. Or then something that really also affects each and every one of us every day, food safety. I've always said that the Brussels effect affects the food we eat and the air we breathe and the products we produce and consume. So a lot of consumer protection, chemical safety, you name it. So the examples are really from across very different types of industries.
The key thing about your perspective and indeed the book is you're sitting in New York at the moment. I'm sitting in London. Many of our listeners and viewers are joining us from different parts of Europe. But I mean, actually, just to take New York and London for a minute, I mean, do you really think then that the Brussels effect is reaching you over there?
So absolutely. And I think if I have a conversation with anybody in the Silicon Valley, the biggest tech companies, whether you talk to Google or Facebook or Apple or Microsoft, you will hear all the time how concerned they are about the regulations coming from the EU. They are the regulations that most shape the business conduct of some of the biggest tech giants in this country. The same thing if you think about the chemical producers in the United States, the farmers, whether they use GMO or not, and how they think about food safety in their slaughterhouses if they want to export to the European Union. So absolutely, it affects us in the United States. Our corporations, but of course, us as consumers, the kind of products that we are consuming, because of the global effect of the European regulations. And I think the same for London. And we can certainly talk about regulatory sovereignty that is awaiting you in a couple of weeks, apparently, in London, and whether that would be the end of the Brussels effect. I doubt it will be. I actually make the case rather strongly in the book that it will not end the Brussels regulatory reach. But yes, it is something that we all feel every day.
I mean, you mentioned London, and we'll come back, I think, to how the US sees Brussels and the Brussels effect, particularly with the new administration. But I mean, yes, you mentioned London. We're in the middle of the Brexit negotiations at the moment. And given the difficulty of, and actually the fact that the difficulty is very much based around also how to be in the single market, the so-called level playing field. Do you think it shows, as you did say in the book, that Brexit is a much easier slogan to execute than a policy, and that in fact, the Brussels effect or the influence is going to be nigh on impossible to escape for the UK, like it or not?
Yeah, absolutely, Shireen. So it is one of those false promises of the Brexit campaign that somehow the UK could unleash itself from the EU's regulatory reach. So I don't see the Brexit undermine the Brussels effect, but it is the Brussels effect that directly undermines the Brexit, because there is no such thing as regulatory sovereignty in today's interdependent economy. And if you think about that, almost half of the UK exports are destined for the EU market. These companies need access to the single market long after leaving the European Union. So that means they need to continue to play by the European rules. The question is then, if you are an automobile manufacturer in the UK and you need to produce cars either to the market that is 6 times the size of yours, the European market, or your domestic market, do you care more about the European standards or your domestic standards? So you want to make sure that you at least can export to the EU. Do you then want to set up a second production line in order to cater to that much smaller domestic market at an increased cost? No, you are producing to the higher European standard. So in that ways, it is an illusion that there is some kind of a regulatory sovereignty awaiting the UK on the other side. In fact, what I argue in the book that the UK has chosen to become a rule taker as opposed to rule maker. And it may find itself living in an ever more regulated Europe going forward, because that pro-market, skeptical about regulation, that voice is no longer around the table when those regulations are being drafted. There is much more space for the kind of Franco-German preferences on regulations to prevail. And that, I think, will mean more rather than less regulation going forward.
Well, let's hear from some of our audience as to whether they agree with the fact that that view of the regulation is entirely the same between the French and the Germans, for example. But just before I come to the audience, you say there's no such thing as regulatory sovereignty. What about regulatory imperialism, though? Is that a reality? Is that the sort of negative face of the Brussels effect?
Right, so there certainly is a criticism in some corners that the Brussels effect is harmful, that it is a manifestation of European regulatory imperialism, how the EU is imposing its standards on the rest of the world and basically forcing the consumers in other markets to adopt the European consumers' preferences as to what kind of products they want or what kind of services they will be receiving. So I understand that in many ways the de facto effect is that the European consumers' preferences do override the preferences elsewhere. But ultimately, whether you can say that the EU is engaged in regulatory imperialism, to me it's quite doubtful as a proposition, because ultimately all the EU is doing is regulating the single market, which it has the sovereign right, even an obligation to do. And if then global companies voluntarily choose to follow the European rules without any mandate from the EU to do so in their home markets, it is hard to attribute that to European regulatory imperialism. And we can also think that there are many winners in other countries as well, many foreign governments who like to free ride on the EU's efforts to dismantle global cartels. They don't have the capacity of the DG Commission to go after those big cartels. They like the EU to take on the big tech and feel the benefits of that. They may want to make sure that their consumers are shielded or that their rivers are shielded from harmful chemicals, but they are not the ones taking on the biggest manufacturers around the world. They are happy to see that they get the benefits, even though the EU does it. There are many American consumers who've repeatedly told me how they are really pleased that their right to privacy is partially more protected because they feel the effects of the GDPR, because their own government has failed to regulate at the level that would be consistent with their preferences. So in case, I don't deny that there is a conversation to be had on the legitimacy of the reach of the EU's power, but there's also a more nuanced defense of what the EU is doing and whether you can call it imperialism.
Exactly, and I guess your point, not just is it consensual, but I mean, just looking this evening, we had a decision by the EU environment ministers on the new EU climate law, which will then go to the Parliament in 2021 for negotiations. So there is a process. It's pretty democratic, actually, despite what some here in London might say. And I guess that sort of gives it a kind of legitimacy that maybe is not well understood by critics. What do you think about that? I mean, the role of the Parliament in all of this, particularly.
Right. So it certainly enhances the democratic accountability within the EU that we have had through all the treaty revisions. If there's been a consistent move, it's been a move towards greater role for the European Parliament. To me, that directly contributes to the democratic legitimacy of the EU's rulemaking. I guess with the Brussels effect, the concern is, what about then the democratic institutions in the United States? Are we overriding the regulators who now are deprived of the ability to provide the regulations for their own constituencies? And there, I think that the question is that whether the EU is just too far removed from the consumers in Africa or America to be dictating those terms as well. And there, I think there are a couple of ways to think about it. So the more that the EU, I in many ways describe the EU as a contingent unilateralist. The EU is always willing to work through multilateral organizations. The EU is willing to work directly, bilaterally, regionally with other countries as well. The EU's main goal is not to be a unilateral regulatory hegemon. But for instance, if the Paris Accord is not sufficient to address the global climate change, the EU is not going to refrain from taking action, even if that action is unilateral. In many ways, I guess the EU would describe itself as a global benevolent hegemon. And there are many players outside of the EU who would be happy to subscribe to that same kind of role that the EU is playing. But that would be more of a second best defense for what the EU is doing. If we cannot do this multilaterally, then we are relying on the EU doing it alone for the rest of us.
That's interesting. Thanks a lot. Now, let me go to our audience, because I think we've got a few questions coming in there. There's something from Leo Birnbaum, actually, at the very beginning. I know that Elmar Brock, hi Elmar Brock, nice to see you there, wants to ask a question as well. So let me ask, if I may, Leo, first of all, do you want to ask your question yourself? I think it concerns consumers and industry.
Yeah, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we'd love to see you as well, if you can let us see.
Yeah, I will do. So
Great.
good evening. Thanks for the interesting thought. Actually, it feels good all for European consumers. I was just wondering whether this regulatory power of the EU is only beneficial to consumers, i.e. protecting, let's say, European consumers from Google. But the question that I have, is it in any way useful to create a European Google rather than just protecting European consumers against an American Google?
So I love the question. So thank you so much, Leo. So first of all, the Brussels effect has been very beneficial for the European industry, not just for the consumers. And the most concrete way that it benefits the business is that it levels the playing field, not just in Europe, but when European companies are competing on the export markets. So we can ask the companies to play by the same rules when they compete in the EU, but we cannot tell what are the rules in the United States, in Latin America, in Asia. But if the companies there are also following the Brussels rules, that will help then the European companies compete. But then to the more direct question, whether the regulatory power somehow can be translated to help the EU create its own Google. And there I would say that regulation is not an enemy necessary to innovation. So the fact that the EU regulates is not the reason we don't have a European Google. But the regulatory power alone is not enough. The EU has been a referee, but I've argued very forcefully that it should also get on the field and play the game, and play offense and play defense. And it should be confident on doing that because it can influence the rules of the game. It is not at the mercy of the game that is rigged against us. But that is not enough. So what would the EU need to do in order to have its own Google? It clearly seems to be that even the Americans are waking up to the need to regulate the market, that more competition is needed. But at the same time, what the EU is probably missing is the idea that we, for instance, do not have the kind of investments in the universities, research and development, the kind of ecosystem that sustains the innovations in the United States. What would help that? For instance, many of the biggest innovations in the United States are not homegrown. The US has been the magnet for the world's talent. If you think about just the leading technology companies, Steve Jobs is a son of a Syrian immigrant. Jeff Bezos is a second-generation Cuban immigrant. If you think about also Facebook, Google, they have Brazilian, Russian founders. So the list could go on. Elon Musk, South African. So in many ways, Europe needs to find a path to become the magnet for the world's talent. Second, what the EU needs to do to catch up with the innovation spirit of the United States is to complete the capital markets union so that we can fund the innovations in the EU with a better functioning, effective capital markets. We need to rewrite our bankruptcy laws so that our talent can also have the license to fail and yet try again and succeed. And that doesn't prevent them from engaging in risk-taking. So there's a lot that needs to be done for the EU to become the place where the next Googles are being developed. But most importantly, we need to finalize the digital single market. The single market is the greatest asset and our source of competitiveness. It is not national champions. It is not industrial policy. It is not closing the EU. There's a lot that can be done, and I am confident that the EU can get on that path as well.
Thank you, Anu, and thank you for the question, Leo. I wonder whether you think to some extent the digital agenda has actually been kind of, stimulated and given a new lease of life by COVID, ironically. The COVID crisis has seen obviously a huge toll economically and not least health-wise, but it does certainly from where I work, which is the European Investment Bank now, definitely seem to have stimulated a whole new kind of push for the digital agenda. Is that something you're seeing, Anu, as well?
So absolutely. I think there are many lessons that we still will analyze what COVID will have taught us. But I think it has shown our dependence on digitalization and the opportunities, how that has sustained our global connections and the ways of doing business, schooling our students and children. So there is a lot of future that will be determined by how the digital economy will evolve. And I would say that the stakes in that conversations are extremely high. The EU is not the only one that wants to assert itself with its regulatory push. We have a Chinese, very strong sort of digital authoritarian view of how to govern the digital economy. We've had a much more techno-libertarian view held by the Americans on what would be the norms for that economy. So in many ways, I think the stakes are enormous, and the EU has a huge incentive to be a voice and be a player in shaping that future. And that's why I take a lot of comfort in the confidence with which the EU is asserting itself this week with unveiling these new 2 acts that will be very consequential for what will happen in the coming years and decade.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. I wonder if Elmar Brock, lovely to see you're here, Mr. Brock. Would you like to ask your question?
Thank you very much. First of all, I like what is first of all, I would like to thank Anna for the answer she gave before. We can have only a good result for the Europeans if we really develop the digital internal market. But one of things is the migration question. The inventors of BioNTech vaccine, which is now leads to the global revolution in health systems by Trump and Johnson with the German vaccine. That is one of the jokes of the last weeks. The scientists who have built up this startup and developed it is a couple, 2 Turkish second generation in Germany. Absolutely. So it's exactly what I told about Jeff Bezos and all that things. The point I would like to make about this imperialism, the European Union uses its sovereign right to develop standards the citizens of the European Union like, in environment, in consumer protection, and so on. And that must be the sovereign right to do that. That has nothing to do with imperialism. But at the same time, if a big market decides to own standards, it's the size of the market, the question of influence to the outside world. Therefore, Boris Johnson can do what he wants to say. Britain will be never sovereign because of these market reasons. They'll be never sovereign, and therefore we have to see in this global order there is no sovereignty, but some are more sovereign than the others. That is the size of the market. The EU market is 13 times bigger than the UK market. And here's now my question. When we talk about the Chinese influence, and that the Chinese have now made this Asian agreement with the purpose to develop standards, is this not a reason that the Americans and Europeans come together again for negotiation, as it was thought in the TPP negotiation, to set up joint standards in order to have the influence in this world instead of China?
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
So I want to thank you for this question. I think it's an absolutely key that we would need to be discussing. So I completely agree when it comes to the importance of the transatlantic agenda and the benefits embedded for the both parties in being ambitious and prioritizing that relationship. We need to think about the regulatory race there is going on. And for instance, you mentioned the increasing integration in Asia, the RCEP, the trade agreement. That is not very ambitious when it comes to standards. So I don't think that will compete with Brussels anytime soon. But it shows that these new standards can emerge from elsewhere. And the European Union is not the only one that may have the desire to shape the global economy. And the most natural partner, now that we have had the election in the United States and we will have a new administration entering, that is committed to multilateralism, that is committed and experienced with transatlantic relations, and that is willing to end this America First way of trying to isolate the US or be transactional about its relations with the rest of the world. I think there is tremendous hope and opportunity that there will be a real reset for a productive transatlantic relationship. There are a couple of challenges that I see. So one is that President-elect Biden will face a very complicated America to govern. His agenda will be full, and there are a long list of domestic challenges that are imperative. So the public health challenge, that the economy post-COVID needs a lot of help to uplift. There are racial tensions that are deep, economic inequalities, and social problems. There's climate change. There are so many issues that he needs to work on. But in many ways, the agenda that he has outlined shows that there are many gains to be had if he wants to work with the European Union. His policies on climate change can be very much aligned with what the European Union is trying to accomplish. The way that he's discussing the digital economy, I see also an opportunity to try to overcome the transatlantic differences, especially given the shared concern that President-elect Biden has and the Europeans have about the Chinese digital authoritarian regime, and the commitment to protect the liberal democracy as the foundation of the internet governance. So I'm hopeful that we will see an immediate reset in trade relations. I expect that the Congress, that remains very divided, continues to be quite united when it comes to a tough approach vis-à-vis China. But President-elect Biden is likely to make a distinction between its allies, like Europe, and countries like China, that it continues to find to be more challenging. So I expect there to be a more productive path forward in thinking about reforming the WTO jointly, in ending certainly the trade war, and looking for the way to reset the trade relations jointly with the European Union.
Thank you. Your speech gives me hope.
I am glad to hear that. Thank you for your question.
Well, we are in the business of trying to cheer everyone up this evening, not to depress you. That was one of the instructions from James at the beginning. But anyway, so that's good, Elmar. Let's maybe come back to that a bit more later on, but there's a couple more questions here from the audience. I'm going to go in order of when they came up rather than anything else. That seems the most democratic way to go. So I'm going to ask Rolf Pfeiffer, if you'd like to ask your question yourself, feel free, about the impact of EU regulatory power.
Sure.
Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Anna, for your remarks. Very, very interesting and thought-provoking. My question around the actual impact of that regulatory power, you would think of classical things such as market size, purchasing power, how interesting is the European market for companies and therefore their appetite to abide by European regulation. What would be other factors that you would count among those that determine how impactful European regulation can be?
So in many ways, I think the main impact is twofold. So the first is that the EU can pursue its deeply felt values relating to sustainability, values relating to fundamental rights as the foundation for privacy protections without compromising its competitiveness. So I think that is the main concrete benefit there, is that these regulatory pursuits don't come at the cost. When you can globalize them, when you can externalize them, first of all, you can spread those values, and through that, a certain vision for the world. It's more of a soft power at that sense, that we can have the whole world move towards greater sustainability and the whole world recognize the importance of a right to privacy. And I think that is something that the Europeans do care about. They don't just care about animals not being tortured in the EU, but there's a direct benefit if we can ensure that the animals are not being tortured in Brazil or Russia or China. So that is a benefit. But then the competitiveness, the idea that we can pursue the vision for globalization that is not about lowering the regulatory standards, but that happens consistent with the higher regulatory standards, and that globalization and the competitiveness of the European industry will be then, will unfold under the terms that the Europeans seem compelling, and that really serves the interest of the European consumers as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's a question from Luca Contrino. Luca, would you like to put your question?
Yes, certainly. Good evening, Anu, and thanks again for this fantastic intervention of yours. And thank you again for this fantastic intervention of yours. That's an interesting point, because I also think, could we start discussing the Brussels effect as a matter of institutional practice, in the sense that now we're also starting to see a move away from EU bloc state negotiations to EU bloc to bloc negotiations? I think the one that comes to mind right now is the expiring Cotonou agreement between the EU and the ACP states, so essentially Africa, Caribbean, Pacific, which will be renegotiated come the end of this year. And again, increasingly a move to negotiate, for example, the trade agreement with Mercosur, concluded in the recent past, and ongoing partnerships with the African Union. So could we start talking about this regulatory power as also a matter of institutional practice and institutional architecture outside the Union as a sort of Brussels effect?
Right. So I think, Luca, you set an important context for the conversation, because in many ways, I think the Brussels effect and the EU's unilateral power is certainly not the only way that the EU is looking to exert influence. The EU has traditionally done this, as you mentioned, through trade agreements. It's been very common to include various regulatory standards for these agreements. The EU has tried to do it through international institutions. There are many ways that the EU does have this ability to leverage its regulations. One question is whether these trade agreements, for instance, are effective and when they might be preferred to the Brussels effect. So first of all, I would say that the EU is quite successful in getting these clauses included into the trade agreements. The EU often has an outsized bargaining power, and its trade partners that need the access to the EU markets, they are willing to include the clauses to have the environmental protections, the labor standards, the human rights standards, the rule of law standards, the competition law standards. Enforcing these agreements is another matter. So the big distinction to the Brussels effect is that the enforcement problem is resolved ex ante. So we may actually see no adjustment in the way the governments are changing their laws, but we see an adjustment in the way the businesses behave. So we see the market outcome, even if we don't see a globalization of law. We see a globalization of practice. Whereas with these trade agreements, we may see a globalization of law, but it's harder to follow it up every time with practice because that requires enforcement. And in many ways, the relative advantage, without undermining at all with the importance of the trade agreements, is that the EU does not need to rely on coercion nor cooperation. It is not at the mercy of trade agreements, for instance, working out. Trade agreements are very political, and they can get hijacked by even domestic constituencies, as we have noticed in the European Union. That the efforts it took to conclude a trade agreement with Canada, I think, was illustrative, that this can be very difficult. And the same thing with the trade agreements that does require ratification in the parliaments in other countries. Trade agreements are important, but when you politicize the exportation of the regulations, the mechanism is different and the challenges are different. But then there are some provisions like human rights provisions that the Brussels effect, the market mechanism doesn't work. So that's when the trade agreements are really the only avenue for the EU to try and do it better, or international institutions or other conventions.
Brilliant. Thank you for the comprehensive answer. Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Great question. Thank you, Luca.
So just to cycle back a bit on the discussion we were having around the US and the EU, I think Francis Cowell wanted to come back on some of the points that Elmar and you were both making around the EU and the US and the relationship. Do you want to put that question yourself, Francis?
Thank you. Thank you. Anu, I'm really enjoying this. I think everybody is. Listen, given that the US has a population of about 365 million, correct me if I'm wrong, and the EU is a bit under 500 million, the size of the domestic markets aren't that very different. And you sort of hinted at this when you were talking about the juxtaposition of the EU and the US in conjunction vis-a-vis China. But given the relative parity of the EU and US markets, surely we must be at the point where the US needs the EU as much. I mean, if Joe Biden wants to really turn around the agenda, he will really need the help of the US. Do you think that's true, or is it something I have not looked at?
So thank you, Francis. I think it's absolutely right that in many ways this idea that America does things alone has not served American interests. The idea that America has treated the EU like an enemy and fought trade wars with the EU, it has been costly to American consumers and workers and companies. So in many ways, the deeper bilateral cooperation with the EU is absolutely in the interest of the United States, especially when it then comes to regulatory standards. There's an additional reason for the US to cooperate, and that is because we don't see a Washington effect, even though the US market is big enough that if the US wanted, it could be also setting the regulations unilaterally. And it was doing so until about 1990. But since then, the US has deliberately chosen to pursue a strong deregulatory agenda. So it has stepped away from that game, and it has ceded the market for the EU to step in and fill the void. So it's not that the US wouldn't have the market size. It's not even that it wouldn't have the regulatory capacity. There's plenty of competent bureaucracy in Washington, DC, but there hasn't been a political will to deploy that capacity towards regulation. But in the end, there's been a side effect that the US has become an obsolete in many of these areas where the EU has been then setting the standards. And this was really reinforced when President Trump decided to step away from all the global fora where he could have been setting the standards jointly with the European Union. So in many ways, by turning its back to globalization, the United States was just trading globalization to more Europeanization. And I think this is something that the US administration can change if it wants to. And I think the European Union will be open to it.
I think so too. I think so too.
maybe I can follow up a little and also remind you all to keep the questions coming, and also actually comments as well as questions. But maybe I can follow up a little on that, Anu, with you. You say if the administration wants to, and that's the key, isn't it? I mean, what is, you understand that the effect of not engaging and withdrawing from the multilateral institutions has been, in effect, that the US has ceded influence. But is that really understood by the lawmakers, do you think? Because as you say, it's not just going to be the administration, it's going to be the lawmakers as well. And don't you think it requires quite a shift in mindset that doesn't really just date back to Trump? I mean, it's an American kind of, you know, US-centric attitude about the world that hasn't really engaged with others in the way that perhaps would have been good for it and others. So how much do you think Biden is really going to change that trend?
Right. So I think you're absolutely right that one of the biggest constraints is that it is not enough that we have the president that would support a multilateral agenda. For international treaties, we need the Congress, and the Congress is deeply divided. And this really traces, as you said, for the time before President Trump. The Congress, when the Republicans took control of the Congress, they did anything to undermine the agenda of President Obama. And I expect this spirit, unfortunately, to continue to set many roadblocks for President Biden. So he will face a very hostile Congress. And as I mentioned, one of the issues that could unite both sides of both parties is the fear of the growing Chinese influence. And there find a common denominator whereby what can we do if we work jointly with the European Union to limit some of those the joint challenges, if you like, that the Europe also shares. But in many ways, I expect that not to be necessarily easy. And the US has been more skeptical of international institutions more traditionally. The US was the key to building this post-World War institutional architecture. It has been the supporter of the global institutions that have helped govern the economy, like the World Trade Organization. But for instance, the WTO was already somewhat of a concern for the United States before President Trump took office. And I don't expect the US to go back to the era where it would not retain that somewhat skeptical voice. In many ways, for instance, some of the issues that the US raised about the WTO are, I think, legitimate. The institution has not been perfect and it needs to be reformed. And in many ways, it will take it for there to be a transatlantic cooperation there, is that the EU is also willing to admit that some of the reforms need to be undertaken. And in many ways, the difference would be that we actually will have a diplomatic dialogue to try to overcome those differences. Another very contested transatlantic issue is the question on digital services tax. Something that the US, it's beyond President Trump. The US has been concerned that it's targeting American companies unfairly. I am hopeful, though, that the OECD process can be revitalized under President Biden, and we can find a cooperative solution to this issue. But I don't want to underestimate. There will be some challenges, and we need a strong cooperative Europe that will skillfully work with the United States to identify those issues where we can reach a common stand, and then work even harder with those issues where the two are further apart.
I mean, you mentioned China, and of course your book, The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World, but for how long? I mean, it's deliberately a provocative title, but what is it, do you think, in terms of regulation, without actually going into the area of protectionism, that the EU could actually be doing to make it more resilient to the influence of China?
So in many ways, the EU should not, in my view, lose its sight that the greatest power that the EU has really stems from the single market. And the single market, that internal goal of building a resilient single market, has become also the source of the EU's external power. Trying to then geopoliticize the Brussels effect in an attempt to take on China, I think can be a real mistake. It can undermine the kind of power that the EU already has and that is serving the EU well. The Brussels effect is not a geopolitical tool. And I am particularly concerned about this turn in a conversation whereby there is an attempt to bring more industrial policy to shape the competition policy of the EU, for instance. We should be mindful that the EU that has been so much exporting its standards, if the EU enters the era of protectionist competition policy, there will be others who will follow the suit. We will see protectionism migrate to countries inside the European Union. Soon we have very different norms governing the French competition authorities' decision on whether a German company should acquire a French company. And we will soon have Brazilians also deciding very differently on whether they will allow a European company to make acquisitions in their market. So this whole idea that we would want to geopoliticize or make this much more of an industrial policy toolkit is something that should give all of us pause. And I think it can have a lot of unintended and harmful consequences. So I think my main message is that it is a power that works well because it is not politicized that way.
That's very interesting. I wonder if the audience has any views on that. I mean, do you actually see manifestations of that already? I mean, why are your alarm bells ringing on this idea of the, as you put it, the geopoliticization of this tool?
Yeah, so I guess when I was on my book tour in Brussels, I got a lot of questions on that. So can we use this in a more geopolitical way? Can we use it to take on China? And it was a very evident conversation in the aftermath of the proposed Siemens-Alstom merger that the Commission rejected. And there was a strong pushback then from France and Germany in particular, and where the two were basically arguing that the EU should have let this merger proceed so that we would have a European champion that could better compete against China. And Commissioner Vestager stood firm. And I actually love the quote that she said, she made, and I included it even in the book, when she said, look, let the Chinese be Chinese. We would be lousy Chinese. They are much better at it. And in many ways, we should not be replicating the state intervention to the economy because the openness will serve Europe much better. And that saga, that the prohibited merger led to this drafting of a Franco-German manifesto on how we should be rewriting our competition policy rules. So I think that does give me pause. And I'm just to be clear, I don't think that there is no situations where the EU shouldn't be assertive. There are certain positions that have shown assertiveness that I think are very well placed and welcome. So the idea that the EU is planning on imposing a carbon border tariff, that's assertive, that will lead to a resistance. I think that may be a fight that is worth fighting, as long as we do it in the WTO consistent way when we design the instrument. I'm also supportive of this idea that we are developing instruments to review the foreign direct investments and, for instance, to curtail the state-backed Chinese acquisitions of European companies. Again, an area where I think there is a good case to be made. The digital services tax, I think that is something where there are very strong arguments why taxation of those companies is currently unfair and where the EU needs to take an affirmative stance. So I am not advocating a weak EU, but I am advocating an EU whose strength is in openness and cooperation and an absolutely robust, resilient single market.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I think we have a question or a comment from Vlado and also Armando as well. Now, they're long questions. I'd like to hear your voice and see you ask them yourselves, really, because you've heard enough of me. Vlado, how do you feel about that?
Hello? Can you hear me?
We can.
But you can see me. I don't know why. Just a second.
Okay.
Okay, now everything is okay. So we can see that the main thing about this Brussels effect is about this capacity about like some things like regulation, standards, things like that. And does it mean that, for example, we have achieved very appropriate standards in many domains like product safety and ecology, waste management, many things. And we probably could say that without these regulations, many of these standards wouldn't have been achieved. So does it mean that other global actors like the US, for example, don't care enough for their citizens?
So thank you, Vlado. I think it's a provocative question, and there are many in the United States that, for instance, believe that the United States government does not care enough for its citizens, and there's a very particular reason for it, and that is the role of money and lobbying in the US political system, which has really elevated the voice of the corporation at the expense of the voice of the citizens. So we know that there's plenty of lobbying taking place in Brussels as well. But the research suggests that the outcomes in the legislative process are much more balanced, meaning that the corporate voice is partially being offset and at least balanced by the access that NGOs and the citizen groups and the various advocacy organizations have to the European institutions. And it's absolutely crucial that we maintain that kind of balance. We need to hear from corporations because we do care about their success. We do care about innovation. We do care about efficient markets. But we also need to hear about consumers and citizens who are consuming these products and services. What do they value? And what kind of economy serves their interests well? But in the United States, there is an unlimited ability that the companies have to contribute to political elections, for instance. And that has tilted the process so that many in America says that it does no longer reflect a healthy democracy. It is serving too much the corporate interest. And in many ways, the Brussels effect is offsetting some of the deficiencies in the US regulatory process. So that would be my take on the very good question that you asked.
Thanks, Anu. Armando, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much for the discussion. So, coming from the Western Balkans, I couldn't help on asking about the Brussels effect and Western Balkans when it comes to Western Balkans. So, when it comes to the Brussels effect, an important variable are the conditionality clauses that EU imposed when it implement international agreements, and the sanctions as well that EU imposes via diplomatic measures and economic sanctions, etc. However, when it comes to Western Balkans, these sanctions are very rare, if they are not applying at all. And it seems that EU is turning a blind eye when it comes to Western Balkans. Do you think that this attitude is making the Brussels effect obsolete in the region and leading countries from the region away from their integration goals? Because, okay, maybe this is a first question, and because I can help follow up when it comes to Brussels effect in the Western Balkans.
Thank you, Armando. I think your question ties really nicely to the earlier question that we had on the trade agreements. And I think in many ways, whether we talk about neighborhood agreements, association agreements, different economic partnership agreements in the neighborhood, including then in the Western Balkans era, it shows how difficult it is to transform the countries if you do not have the domestic buy-in of the main actors, even if you have the political commitment from the government to undertake some measures. We can see backsliding, we can see non-compliance, and we see an imperfect record by the EU to make sure that compliance is being achieved. That's why in many ways the Brussels effect, which I refer to more of a market-based instrument as opposed to political agreement, has certain advantages. And those can stick better and actually then lead to a change, because we playing off against the company's own self-interest, which is a very powerful way to transform the economies. Of course, what we are trying to accomplish in the Western Balkans goes beyond privacy regulation, goes beyond food safety, goes beyond environmental standards. There's more of a political set of goals, all of which cannot be accomplished through market forces alone. So some of the issues that you identify remain as a challenge, and there needs to be more of an effective tools of doing it. But it reminds me also, if you think about the EU has a hard time even enforcing some of those important goals within the EU itself, within its own member states, the struggles that it has had with rule of law backsliding and democracy in countries like Poland and Hungary, which shows that it is very difficult to work if you have a reluctant government that actually is not committed to some of those principles. So I'm sorry I don't have a kind of a recipe or an uplifting way that I can say that I know how we can fix the issues that you very correctly articulate. But I think in many ways, it just illustrates that when we don't work with a market-based instrument, some of the political challenges are severe and long-lasting.
And I think, Anu, if I may, because we're coming to the end of our really fascinating discussion, but just to pick up on that point within the EU, which we haven't really talked about so much, I mean, what is your perspective for the future, given that we have, and I'm being a bit provocative here, but we've had an enlargement of the EU. I mean, it's not been that recent, but we now have 27. Maybe we'll have more, some from the Western Balkans, perhaps. Is there a danger, though, that that precious thing, the single market, cannot actually withstand more members and more qualified decision making, and that it is already creaking under the strain, and therefore the Brussels effect may well get watered down? Or do you think it's that is its strength?
So look, I think that's the way I was advocating for openness when it comes to migration. One way to embrace a new sort of vitality and inject new vitality into the single market as well is to enlarge the single market. But there's a trade-off between size and heterogeneity. So in many ways, the larger the market, the more powerful the single market can be. But when you integrate countries that have different values or different capacities to comply, you do risk that sometimes it is harder to get the countries on the same page. That's why we have qualified majority voting, because we can no longer rely on getting everybody to agree. And that's why you sometimes win, you sometimes lose, but that's the bargain that you make. And yes, there can be many cracks. And as we've seen, I already mentioned Poland and Hungary in particular as current challenges. That's something that you can extract concessions before accession. But then the question is, how do you control when the countries are within the EU? And Hungary and Poland certainly haven't done favors to the member states that are looking to enter the union, because there's a deeper skepticism of how you can absorb the countries and how they can commit to the European values. At the same time, I don't believe in fortress Europe when it comes to accepting migrants, when it comes to accepting new member states, but we do need to be mindful of how do we make sure that we integrate these countries, that we bring them to the fold of the values that are absolutely crucial of who we are by definition, and that we can work with them before they accession, after the accession, in a way that will serve to strengthen and not undermine some of those fundamental pillars that I think explain a lot of the success that we have experienced.
Thank you so much. All the more reason to stay firm on the Brexit negotiations from the EU side, I mean. Listen, thank you so much, Anu. That was a fascinating conversation. I know that our audiences have been engaging, and audiences enjoyed it as well. Thank you all of you for your great questions as well. Of course, you can, I'll give you a little plug. You can buy the book. There's the book again. And I hope we'll get a chance to talk again in this format. I think James is going to tell us a little bit about, I think we're going to be putting it up on YouTube, right? So if you missed a bit, or you had to go make a cup of tea, you can catch it later. Thank you very much, Anu.
Thank you, Shireen. Really appreciate the way you were steering the conversation. And thank you, everyone, for a terrific set of questions. It was really, really a pleasure.
Thank you, Shireen and Anu. Thank you for everybody. The YPAs, you will be informed when you can have another session directly with Anu to ask questions that we didn't get the chance to get around today. So good evening, everybody, and thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks, all of you. Have a very safe, healthy, and happy break as well. Cheers.
Cheerio.